Well, now that mandatory minicamp is wrapped up in Renton for the Seahawks and OTAs, official activities are behind us, and they even wrapped up a day earlier than planned. The Seahawks now have their longest offseason break before training camp kicks off officially about 6 weeks from now. And so I'm going to give you my impression of the 5 biggest storylines heading into the Seahawks' biggest break of the offseason coming up today on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. Hope you're enjoying Father's Day weekend. Have some cool plans. Get together with the family. Be here in the Pacific Northwest, enjoying some nice weather and still enjoying a first-place baseball team as the Mariners win the first of 3 against the Rangers this weekend, extend their lead to 6.5 games. So that's fun. Gives us a little something to pass the time until football season begins properly at the end of July when we start our first training camp under Mike Macdonald and his staff. Follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell button for notification of new episodes. If you prefer audio podcasts, you can get the show anywhere that you like to listen to audio podcasts. But if you want to get rid of the ads for a small monthly fee, you can do that only on Spotify. Other ways you can support the show are with super likes or by buying me a coffee. All of those links will be down below in the description. Just wanted to check in this weekend and kind of give you my impressions of things that I'm seeing, hearing, reading, coming out of minicamp. And as expected, it was a lot more voluminous as far as storylines. There's just a lot more to talk about, a lot more to see, even though Mike Macdonald kind of let school out early and shortened the 3-day minicamp to 2 days because he thought that they had gotten so much accomplished. But when you read all the reporting, you see some of the training highlights and get some impressions from some of the players that we heard interviewed, as well as Mike Macdonald. We feel like we've been saying this for a couple months now, but every single day we get a little bit more of a clue, a little bit more information as to what this organization is going to look like, what this team and roster are going to look like moving forward. And I will tell you this, that a little spoiler alert, I think all 5 of these storylines I'm about to highlight are all what I would consider positive. I don't have this as one of the 5, but even the fact that Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker aren't out there on the field yet, the 2 new inside linebackers, and there's a lot of strife. There's a lot of concern about that, understandably so. But I still even look at the bright side there. A little bonus storyline here for you. First of all, Mike Macdonald sounds very confident that Jerome Baker and Terrell Dodson are going to be ready for the start of training camp. Now, maybe they'll take some ramp-up time, but he did seem to indicate that their injuries aren't such that they'll keep them out beyond the beginning of training camp. And then, in other news, other positions, we'll find out more about Abe Lucas at that time too. But in the meantime, heard some really positive things, especially out of this mandatory minicamp about the performance of John Radigan, who's not new to the organization, didn't just come off the street. We have seen some moments. He had to step in for Bobby Wagner a couple seasons ago when he was injured. And play some meaningful reps. We saw him play middle linebacker in the preseason last year. Same with Patrick O'Connell, the undrafted free agent out of Montana. Both those guys had some interceptions in 11-on-11 the last day of camp. And O'Connell, I believe, had Tyrese Knight, the rookie out of UTEP, had back-to-back interceptions. So those guys doing some things in coverage as well. But the things you hear about O'Connell are very promising. And if you saw the offseason some of the workout stats and personal benchmarks that were posted a couple of months ago. And I think Geno Smith posted them because he was really happy with his miles per hour, his GPS tracking speed. But a lot of people noticed that Patrick O'Connell was way up there high too. And while he may be undersized at 230 pounds, isn't that kind of the trend for weak side linebackers, weak side in middle linebackers in the league these days? More coverage responsibilities. And we're just seeing fewer of those 240, 245 pound guys. So promising, they got extra reps. And so, until we see otherwise, I'm going to be optimistic that Dodson and Baker will be back for camp. And now, they get to benefit from Radigan, O'Connell, Knight getting all those extra reps. The one mystery is, and I mentioned this on Twitter the other day, is I'm really curious as to where the heck Drake Thomas is. If you remember last year, Seahawks poached him off the Raiders practice squad right at the end of cuts. Raiders were reportedly really upset about that. Not that the Seahawks did anything wrong, but just upset that they lost him. They were hoping to pass him through because he really showed some things in the preseason, especially against the run. But it's been very mysterious with Drake Thomas. And he suffered a knee injury, went on injury reserve late last season. There were no details about that. And now the fact that I reached out to Corbin Smith of All Seahawks and Locked On Seahawks the other day, Seahawks beat reporter, and he said, honestly, he hasn't seen him. No one's asked Macdonald about Thomas. And so it leads me to believe that that knee injury, maybe it was an ACL, maybe it was something more serious. And just because he's a third string player on the depth chart at this moment, that he's just not going to be ready for a while. But still some promising things coming out of there. Little bonus storyline there for you today. But let's get into this. So number one, I think and this has been evident now for a while, but I think it really came to the forefront in minicamp, in interviews with Laken Tomlinson, interviews with Leonard Williams, interviews with DK Metcalf. Number one storyline is that players are buying in. I mean, it's a new scheme, new coaching staff, taken over for a legend in Pete Carroll after 15 years at the helm. Players seem to be buying into what's going on. You hear DK Metcalf talk about how much he loves the offense and how they're using him so far. Geno Smith really excited and thinks that they're going to be on the same page, that he and Ryan Grubb are a fit, are hand in glove, that he is seeing plays he's never seen drawn up before, and that excites him. Leonard Williams, Devin Witherspoon talking about how much they're loving the defensive scheme so far. Williams letting us know the other day in his interview that he's been asked to play 6 different positions up and down the line so far by Mike Macdonald. The buy-in from someone like Draymond Jones, who's going to be, it may not be a full-time position switch from defensive line, defensive end to outside linebacker, but that it sounds like the hints that we're getting from Macdonald, they've been saying for months they have a cool plan for him. And then we see the Jones workout videos from this offseason where he's training with some outside linebacker drills, working on drops, things of that nature. And then it comes out of minicamp that he's moving all around as well, that we may not be talking about a full-time move to outside linebacker, but just that disguise, sort of ninja versatility that Mike Macdonald's known for and that he talks about so much, that Jones has bought into the point that he has adapted his offseason training regimen to it to get ready for it. And that Macdonald specifically mentioned how great a shape he came in. And so here's a guy who, took a lot of criticism last year after signing the biggest free agent deal in Seahawks history, that didn't live up to his expectations or anyone else's. Although we saw more productivity late in the year when he was moved from the interior to more of a big edge defensive end position. But that a guy like that, and there's talk this offseason, they should trade him, they should cut him, they could save the money, it was a mistake. He hears those things, right? He's on social media, he's not immune to that. But that instead of grumbling about that, asking his agent for a trade, all the different options that players have at their disposal these days, he just decided to get to work. And the more you hear Mike Macdonald talk about him, the more you think, okay, this is legitimate. Like, they're not just paying lip service, hoping to get something out of an investment. They really see a plan, to the point that they put their money where their mouth is. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But this feels like tangible excitement, like visceral, tangible excitement that we're getting from these players, not just lip service about how things are going so far. So that's the first one. I feel like there's buy-in, and that's always the biggest challenge with a new coach, especially one following such an established legendary figure. Number 2, however, is there's still a lot to learn. We heard a couple of weeks ago that Macdonald thought he had 50% of the defense installed. This week, we heard that number on offense and defense be, depending on who you're talking to, 50 to 60% installed. So here we are coming out of minicamp, and players are loving what's happening, and yet it's not all even in yet. And this is something that, there's a lot written in the last couple of weeks about Macdonald's teaching style and how he installs this stuff, and particularly on defense, and how he simplifies it and breaks it down so you can use less terminology and sometimes single words, and that he installs this stuff slowly enough so that players can grasp it and master it before they move on to something else, so that everyone's on the same page, so they can make a simple defensive call. And within that call, players have a multitude of options, but they're all going to know which one is being called for depending on the situation. And so it's exciting to me to hear these first two things combined, right? We're hearing the players' enthusiasm for the system, and then we're also hearing all of this stuff about how particular and how detailed and nuanced Macdonald and his staff are at installing this stuff. Even on offense with Ryan Grubb as well, we're hearing it. DK is incredibly excited about how he's going to be used. And then what got me even more enthused about that idea, and DK was a big topic this week, by the way. I almost made him an entire storyline, but we're going to do a whole episode next week just about DK, whether there's more in the tank, as I've been saying for a while, what might be ahead for DK, and are we looking at a big time breakout year at a time when it'll make him a lot of money because wide receivers are getting paid. But Jake Bobo was interviewed this last week, and to hear him talk about how, wait till you see what they're going to do with DK Metcalf. They're using him in an entirely different way. That's exciting to me. That, I've been saying for years, whether it's Darrell Bevell, Brian Schottenheimer, Shane Waldron, that typically when I get frustrated by an offensive coordinator not being effective enough, it's not play calling, specifically play in, play out. I think that term gets thrown around kind of loosely and a little bit lazily at times. To me, it's personnel usage and consistency of usage. It's getting guys involved early and often, and it's putting guys in a position to succeed, keeping them away from things they're not good at and leaning into what they're good at. And we hear that kind of talk from coaches all the time, but don't often see it backed up on the field. I don't believe, from Waldron and at times Schottenheimer, Bevell. The best, most simple example I can ever give of that is what happened with Jimmy Graham when he was here, where you give up all that draft capital and player capital and Max Unger to go get a guy in his prime, a guy who is one of the most dominant weapons in the NFL at that time. And then you acquire him and try and change who he is and don't use him to his strengths. DK is on a path here, right? Over his first 5 years, some of his numbers are right up there with some of the great receivers that we've seen in our generation. And yet I still don't feel like he's been used to his fullest. So to hear people talk about what's in store excites me. And we'll dive into that deeper next week. The third biggest storyline for me coming out of this camp heading into the break is this secondary appears to be a major strength of the defensive roster. We've talked a lot about the defensive front and all the depth there and all the versatility there. And that's kind of the first thing that stood out this minicamp or this offseason in all the OTAs. But this minicamp in particular, what'd you hear about during the 2 days from 11 on 11s? Guys making plays on the ball at a time when you're not allowed contact, but guys jumping up and tipping the ball to themselves, tipping the ball to other people, really challenging the offense. And it comes at a time when you're also hearing that Geno Smith seem like he's really in control of this offense. And you hear positive reports about his performance. And yet these guys on defense are making plays. And it's everybody, right? It's everyone. We've heard over the last couple of days, Mike Jackson had a pick six. Reek Woolen, Devin Witherspoon had picks. DJ James and Nathaniel Pritchett or Nehemiah Pritchett, the two Auburn rookies that were drafted this year. And I think that's what to me, that's kind of the underlying storyline of this is, and I've talked about this before, we all thought that secondary was good. I didn't even mention Trey Brown. He had a pick during the minicamp as well, in the end zone, I believe, coming down with the ball there. That they were already talented, young, varied, deep, and yet then they go out and they add to a strength by just sticking to their board and taking James and Pritchett in the draft. And when that happened, we all kind of went, huh, wasn't expecting that. And there was a little bit of pushback, but I think most people were into it because you just can never have too many of those guys. And so to add two talented players like Pritchett and James to that group, now the competition, and it's on, right? Like Mike Jackson, if he's had to come to camp every single year and battle for his job, more so this year than ever, especially with, very little guaranteed money on his deal. Like he's got to make the team. Artie Burns had a pick this week. Like he's the grizzled old veteran, 28 years now on a 1-year veteran minimum deal. Like he has to perform. And so maybe taking those two corners is a wake-up call to some of these guys. But also, you're just setting yourselves up for that to continue to be a strength of the roster moving forward because Trey Brown's in the last year of his deal. Maybe he plays really well this year and prices himself out of the Seahawks price range, pulls a DJ Reed and we end up losing him. Well, now you can backfill because you've set yourselves up. It's exciting to think what they can do because I think getting turnovers is something that's been very, very inconsistent and at times missing over the last 5-6 years from the Seattle defense. And it was something that was a cornerstone of Pete Carroll defenses throughout his career. And certainly the first half of his tenure here in Seattle, it was. And, if you're as old and turning gray as I am, you remember even in back in the 80s, some of those Seahawks defenses that might not have been really stout, but man, they always seemed to force turnovers and make plays. We got used to that, and it kind of helped build that 12th man atmosphere at the Kingdome and then what is now Lumen Field. And I've been saying for a while, I think I think the crowd noise and the home field advantage has dissipated over the last few years, and I think most of that reason can be attributed to the defense. It's deflating for the crowd when you continue to give up third downs, when you're not getting the ball, taking the ball away from the other team, when you can't stop the run. Getting back to that style of defense where the crowd knows that they have a chance to go 3 and out or take the ball away, get a sack on any given drive. I think that some of that excitement, I think that's the thing that will bring that enthusiasm back to the stadium. And that's going to be a huge key, I think, moving forward. Storyline number 4, this offensive line that we're all watching so closely, that we all agree needs to be better in order for Geno Smith to operate at his best, those running backs, that it may look different than we think, right? We won't know about Abe Lucas. And I'm still of the school of thought that I'll believe it when I see it. And if he's not ready by week 1, I'm okay with that. I think George Fant was an enlightened signing this offseason. Just a really solid veteran you can plug in there. But then you start to see some of the other positions and, a lot of attention and concern about the interior offensive line. They go out and they add a bunch of bodies. And they add a bunch of young guys. They draft a bunch of young guys. Where those guys played consistently throughout the offseason and then again in mandatory minicamp surprised me. And I think it's indicative about how they might feel about some of these guys. First of all, for those of you who have questioned whether Olu Oluwatimi is the starting center or not, that has not been a question throughout OTAs. I think the Seahawks have spoken about how they feel about him in how the rep breakdown has gone. He is unquestionably the number 1 center at this point. At left guard, Laken Tomlinson, former All-Pro, but coming off a couple of years in New York and 1 year in particular, and where his PFF grades were down and people thought maybe he was washed up, and we weren't getting the Laken Tomlinson that we would hope to get. From day one, it's been the starter at left guard. Even though there's all those other bodies that the Seahawks have thrown at the roster, and a guy like Tremaine Antrim, who won a starting job at one point in LA and then got hurt. Now, Anthony Bradford was hurt, only came back in mandatory minicamp, so he wasn't able to push, and they might have moved him over, but Satawa Lamea, the tackle, looks like a guard convert out of Utah, who I think is really talented. They've moved him to the left side. Remember what we saw a lot during the Pete Carroll years, especially on that offensive line, is they would divvy those reps up no matter who looked like the clear-cut starter. One day, this happened last year with Evan Brown and Oluwatimi. One day, Brown would get all the number one reps. Oluwatimi would get them all the next day. This staff isn't approaching it that way, from what it appears, from everything I'm reading. Tomlinson's been the clear-cut number one at left guard. Oluwatimi's been the clear-cut at center. And most surprisingly of all, is McClendon Curtis has been the clear-cut guy at right guard getting all the number one reps, despite the fact that Christian Haynes was their third round draft pick, number 81 overall. And most of us, me included, extremely high on him, expect him to be the starter as a rookie. But they haven't played that game with him. Unless I missed it, he hasn't been getting any first team reps. It's been Curtis every day. Every report you read, Curtis again at right guard. And if you're surprised by that, I would remind you of the history there. Another guy at the very, very end of training camp last year, that as teams are trying to sneak guys through waivers and get him to the practice squad, the Seahawks grabbed him off of the Raiders practice squad. He was a guy, played at a small school, Chattanooga. I think it was Chattanooga. Don't have it in my notes. That was off the top of my head. Let me know if I'm wrong in the comments down below. But a guy who's big, long, physical, athletic, and they liked him so much last year after they snagged him from the Raiders that they carried him on the roster the entire season, even though he was rarely active, if ever. I don't think it would be a shock at this point if McClendon Curtis is the starting right guard against the Broncos week 1, and that they make Haynes earn that. We've seen crazier things, right? And if you think, because I know this mentality can be out there, right? That, well, if you knew Curtis was that good, and if he ends up really proving to be an outstanding player, then why did we draft a right guard in the third? Haynes can move. We've never seen him play left guard before, but we saw him play center at the Senior Bowl. So I wouldn't give up on that idea yet. And look, I'm not saying that I think Haynes has lost his opportunity to start at right guard. I'm just saying that Curtis is the guy right now, and he's been the guy the entire offseason. And I was surprised by that. I would have thought they would have given Haynes some more run. So let's wait and see what that offensive line looks like in the preseason. It's definitely going to be a storyline moving forward. And it's kind of fun, honestly, because I do think the real positive here is they have more options, more good, solid options than they've had in a long time. Look, let's talk about tackle again for a second. Stone Forsythe has put some good reps on tape the last couple of years since the Seahawks drafted him in 2020. And yet he seems, based on some of the reports of how reps are being divvied out, he seems like he's the fourth guy at right guard at times. That it's Fant, and then it's Raekwon O'Neal, and then it's Mike Jarrell maybe, and maybe even the kid out of South Dakota State that I'm blanking on his name now. Is it Garrett Greenfield is in there? You don't hear much about Stone Forsythe. They're giving those young guys the reps. Now Stone could play left and right tackle, and maybe they see him more at left tackle because of the existence of that group of guys that are more comfortable on the right. But it's interesting to me. Stone Forsythe's a guy that if they cut him, he's going to be picked up by someone, make a roster. He's got some bad reps on tape, sure, but he's got some really good ones too. And I'll just never forget the day he was drafted. I read multiple scouting reports that this guy, as a pass protector, could have started in the NFL day one, right after he was drafted. There's some talent there. He's big, he's long, and yet the Seahawks have brought in so many options there that he seems to be falling down the depth chart. And that I only see that as a good thing. My fifth and final big storyline, and I think coming out of minicamp into the break, is the salary cap is okay, at least for now. And that they might be doing things differently than they've done in the past. So after making some moves last week, the Seahawks are now $8.5 million under the salary cap. That should be, according to Curtis Allen, that should be enough for practice squad, injured reserve, and to leave a little bit so you have some flexibility at the trade deadline if you need to make an acquisition, or maybe before the trade deadline, right? Like, let's see, what if Baker or Dodson has a setback and they feel like they need to go out and acquire a linebacker at the cut to 53. Maybe it's a guy that'll cost them a little bit more than the vet minimum, right? They've given themselves that flexibility now. And one of the ways they've done it is, it seems like their new cap guy, right? Matt Thomas out, Joey Lane in, that he's been able to convince John Schneider to do things a little differently. The best example of this is the Draymond Jones deal. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, so we're going to tie this back in. The Seahawks added 2 void years to his deal and then converted some salary to bonus. And in doing so, they cleared a bunch of cap space, got them to $8.5 million under the cap. The Seahawks have never, under John Schneider and formerly Pete Carroll, ever done void years except in that COVID year when you had to get creative, where the salary cap was stagnant, didn't move up. They had to do it. Did it with Kerry Hyder, I think Carlos Dunlap. There were some other moves they were trying to make there to fortify that defensive line, where they did play with some void years. And that's just basically adding a couple of dummy years onto the end of the contract so you can spread out the bonus cap hit. So it does create some dead cap in years that they're not technically under contract. And so what it ends up looking like is that I think, and maybe some of this is based on, what we talked about at the top of the show, Macdonald and his staff liking Jones' versatility and what he can bring to the table, especially as a pass rusher. Jones buying into it, that he's probably more likely after this contract adjustment now to be with the team through 2025 at least. Now, it's not out of the question that you can move on from him if things don't go exceptionally well. You could still save $11.5 million in cap space in 25 by trading and releasing him, but you would incur $14 million in dead cap space. And then by adding the void years on, now you're looking at $5 million in dead cap in 26 and 2.5 in 27. What this means to me is, if he comes out and plays well and it proves he's a fit in this system, Macdonald gets the most out of him, that he becomes an extension candidate next year. But it also just signals to me that they may be open to a new way of doing things. We also saw it in how they approached undrafted free agents after the draft, in that they were guaranteeing more salary with offset language. And that's something that they didn't do in the past. But when you look at this undrafted class and how good it is and how highly it's been ranked, that it may have helped in their recruiting process to be able to convince some better talent to come here and sign as an undrafted free agent. So it gives you some flexibility at the deadline. If there's a massive injury or anything, you need to go out and make an acquisition, you can do that now. It drops. I remember looking at it the other day. I think they were 40 million over the cap or something like that. It's 30 or 40 million over the cap for 2025. It's about $20 million over the cap in 2025. If that makes you nervous, it shouldn't. There's some easy levers that they can pull next offseason to drop that dramatically, be able to get everybody signed, be able to go out and make an acquisition or two if they need to, which, Smith's contract, DK Metcalf's. You could extend Jones. And again, I think that becomes a storyline. If he has an excellent season this year, just 27 years old still, that we could be talking about extending him next year. And then also Tyler Lockett. Just those 4 players, Geno, DK, Tyler, Draymond Jones, lots of flexibility in those deals heading into next year. It's what's been interesting to me about this offseason and how they've approached the cap is, at any given moment, it looked like cap space was gone, and yet they kept making moves. Like, this just seemed like almost a master class in how to manage the cap this offseason and make all the moves that you need to, still go out and add a lot of volume, a lot of quality bulk and volume in free agency to address some needs. be able to take care of some of your own guys in-house. And then still at the end of the day, and we heard it all offseason. Every time Schneider would be asked about it, he just kind of brushed it off. Like, there's triggers in place. There's things that we have plans for. They don't ever go make these moves blindly. Just go get that guy, make it happen no matter what. We'll figure the rest out later. This was all planned out. They do seem a little more willing now to kick the can down the road a little bit, but not nearly in as reckless a way as we've seen teams like the Cowboys and the Saints and the Rams in years past. And they're getting out from under it now. But Seahawks don't ever seem to be willing to go more than a year of, moving some dead cap out or moving some cap space, knowing that they also have levers they can pull next year to get through it. Can never have too much cowbell, right? What do you think? What are some of the things that stood out to you from everything you read and heard coming out of minicamp? Let me know. And some of the storylines that you think are important headed over the next 6 weeks, right? And I feel good about this group. I feel good about this group of players. I feel good about this group as characters and people and their commitment to football. I don't worry about any trouble arising over the next 6 weeks. And so, we've got a lot to talk about between now and then. Jeff Simmons is going to be joining me. We're shooting for Monday, so stay tuned for that. And we're going to talk about 2025 roster, what that looks like now, kind of what some big needs might be, looking ahead, also some cap implications. We'll get a little deeper into that. And then, as I mentioned, going to take a deeper look at DK Metcalf and what appears to be a commitment to really making him a focal point of the offense and getting even more of him than we've seen. Lots of other stuff on the calendar as well. Best way to stay up with it all is subscribe on all the platforms. Hit that bell button on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at Seahawks Forever. Forever and always go Hawks. Thanks for watching the show and supporting the channel, you guys. Talk to you soon.